So now we come to Chapter 7, which is the critical period from 1781 until 1789. The critical period, of course, being for our new country. So on our timeline, again, as a quick review, this quarter we've gone over and learned about the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. Then we learned about the series of acts beginning with the Stamp Act in 1765. Then in 1767, England had the Townshend Acts that came into place. Then, as a result of all these Stamp Acts and other acts, the Boston Massacre broke out in 1770. Next, because of the Boston Massacre, then the Boston Tea Party, the Parliament in England instituted what was called the Coercive Acts, but the Patriots called them the Intolerable Acts, and this took place in 1774. Then we have the Revolution take place from 1775 until 1783. The American colonists won. They drew up their Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Treaty Paris was drawn up and signed in 1783 at the end of the war. And now in this chapter, we're talking about the Constitution and that it was adopted in 1787, and we're going to talk more details about that in this chapter. So, what are the big ideas for this chapter? What were the weaknesses of the Confederation government? Then, what compromises and key principles emerged from the Constitutional Convention? Then, what were the significant differences between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist? So basically, we have 3 sections in Chapter 7, and the first section, we should be able to answer what were the weaknesses of the Confederation government. Then in the second section of this chapter, should be able to answer what compromises and key principles emerged from the Constitutional Convention. And then the third section, you should be able to answer what were the significant differences between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. So moving on, the 1780s were arguably the most critical decade in America's history. It's when our government was formed. So in this first section, the guiding questions that you need to be able to answer at the end of it are, what was the nature and structure of the Confederation government? What were the successes and failures of the Confederation? First of all, what does Confederation mean? It is a close alliance of sovereign states. So now we're not talking about colonies anymore. We are talking about states, the 13 original states. So in our first section named Confederation, we talk about the Articles of Confederation. They were drafted by a committee headed by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. He favored a strong central government, which was not a popular idea in the new country. He produced a central government with a minimal authority, is what the Articles of Confederation did. So we have the states that were in a firm league of friendship. This is a great way of putting it, because in friendship, you're not always getting along, which is true of what was going on in the states. So we had in this confederation a unicameral legislature, unicameral meaning that we only have one governmental body ruling the nation. In this thought, only each state had only one vote in all matters. So with this confederation, each state could send anywhere between 2 to 7 representatives, but no matter how many numbers they each had to agree to have on what they wanted for their one vote. One vote. This was important legislation. Any important legislation required the approval of at least 9 of the 13 states, which is not quite 70% of the popular vote among the legislatures. For example, if the nation wanted to declare war, approve treaties, coin money, have any type of Indian affairs, the post office, decide disputes between states, and government of the Western territories, all of those types of issues, 9 states had to approve it. At least 9 had to approve it. But to amend or ratify the articles required all 13 states' approval. So the chief executive of this Congress, this Confederation, had almost no power whatsoever. So he's simply what is called a figurehead. He is chosen by the legislature and completely under its control. 3 officials handled most of the administrative duties, and there was no national judiciary. What does that mean exactly? Basically, no national judiciary meant there were no form of courts on the federal level. And believe it or not, the states could ignore requests for money, which we would call federal taxes. So in its years of existence, the Confederation government barely had enough revenue to cover its expenses, which is not a beneficial way to operate. But what are the successes of this confederation that was set up initially? Well, in the Treaty of Paris that was signed, it provided prestige initially for our new country. England has now recognized America as its own country. But it revealed the weaknesses in the Confederation that were set up. Britain began violating the treaty, specifically along the Great Lakes area with their forts where they were trading for furs. So in the Western lands, Maryland was concerned about how the Western lands would be handled. But states with Western claims, they did have to eventually yield those claims to the federal government. This was more specifically, Massachusetts was one of them, but Virginia and New York had huge tracts of the Western lands. So Maryland and other smaller states that didn't have claims to these lands, they had no claims. They would eventually make Virginia and New York give up those Western claims for the Western territories because it would make those states too big and too powerful. So the area north of the Ohio River was called the Northwest Territory. Here we have a map. You can see where Virginia and Massachusetts, Connecticut, but if you can look, you can see New York also has a big claim up in the Canada area. There were some disputes where you see the brown, what is today Vermont, and the northern part of Maine. You can also see now that we have in the blue our 13 states. Maine is not its own state yet, but these original 13 states are New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. To remember these first 13 colonies, 13 states, you could say this sentence: Georgia and Maddie do not need new sounding vibes making game noises celebrating victory. If you use that sentence, it'll give you the first letter of each one. Of course, Georgia being G for Georgia, Maddie being M for Maryland, do being D for Delaware, not N being for New Hampshire, etc. You can see how that is a mnemonic that can help you remember the names of the 13 original states. And the name of this mnemonic or sentence again was Georgia and Maddie do not need new sounding vibes making game noises celebrating victory. I hope that may help some of you to learn which states were a part of the 13 original states. Okay, so now, since we have identified that there are some weaknesses to the Confederation, the government that has been set up, the governing men, the founding fathers, realized that we need to make some amendments. So first they make a amendment that comes up is an Ordinance of 1784. This is Thomas Jefferson's idea, this first one. It never actually went into effect. And the reason for that is it gave too much power to newly created states. Plus, there was an issue and division on the legality of slavery in this first ordinance. So next we have a land ordinance of 1785, which concentrated on new settlements and also on townships. So each township contained 36 sections of 640 acres each. You can see in this graph how they tried to set up a way to settle the western lands. And so we have that you would have one block in this graph would represent a block of land that would be 1 square mile. And so you can see it's divided into smaller quarter of a quarter section, which is 40 acres. If someone wanted to go in and purchase 40 acres and settle 40 acres, or they could settle half of a quarter section, 80 acres, or they could settle a quarter section of 160 acres, and then they have half a section of 320 acres. All of this would mean that then once that was settled, those acreage was settled by new inhabitants in this area, then they could establish a township. And then the income from the sale of Section 16 was reserved for education. So what that means is once the first 15 and then 16 squares were settled, that 16th one was reserved for education in that area. Those monies would be used towards education. But that didn't mean that schools were going to be built in this particular township. They'd have to find and agree where that would happen. So next we have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which ended up making the best sense because it concentrated more on government rather than how the settlements were happening specifically. I mean, that's why this ended up being more of a lasting ordinance. So we had at least 3, at most 5 states. So what that means basically is this area, this Northwest or Western Land Claims area specifically in the territory, means that they're going to break up this area into at least 3 states and at most 5 states. That's kind of controlling how that new land, the Northwest Territory, is going to be divided up. So they also decided on 3 stages to become a state. So in this Northwest Territory, What does it take to become a new state? Remember, we already have our 13 original states. What does it take to become the 14th, the 15th, the 16th, or whatever state into the Union? So the first stage was under direct control of federal government. When you've had 500 free men in an area, then you could look at becoming a state. That was your first stage to becoming a state. A second stage, you are now a territory, and you can elect a legislature and send representatives to Congress. But the governor appointed by national governments, and the government of this new state is appointed by the national governments, and the national government could veto any act passed by a territorial legislature. And you had a representative in Congress, but he couldn't actually vote. That was the second stage. The third stage is once you have 60,000 inhabitants in this territory, you can actually draw up a state constitution and be admitted as a state. Ohio was the first state entered into the Union under this Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So this was explicitly emphasizing the importance of education. That was back when you saw that once you had 16 townships settled, that the monies from that 16th township, monies towards the government, would go towards or be used for schools and education. These new areas had to prohibit slavery, and most future states that entered the Union were entering in a similar way. That's important to know, that they're being established in an orderly fashion, and all of this is in the same method. And then again, there were 3 stages to becoming from a settlement to a territory into a state of the Union. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. That was strengthened in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It was begun in the Ordinance of 1785, but in the 2 years later, 1787, they wanted to strengthen the existence of education in schools. So now, these failures of the Confederation, there was financial weakness. It couldn't necessarily support itself. Reason being, hard money was scarce. Hard money meaning silver and gold, physical silver and gold. So now each of the states started making their own paper money, but that paper money began having declining value as more and more money is being printed by each of these states. Here again, the states are printing their own currencies. So just to reiterate, even though we do have failures of this Confederation, the mere existence of this Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is important to remember, because from another book I have, The Narrative of American History, I'm reading a sentence here that's important to recognize. This ordinance, it represented a sharp break with the imperialistic assumption behind European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. The new states were being admitted to the American Republic as equals. So basically what that is saying when we're talking about these most future states entered into the Union in a similar way, what we're saying here, when it's not an assumption of expansion in the Western Hemisphere, basically everybody's equal. The new states coming in are equal. Once they've gone through these 3 stages and become a state, they are equal with the existing states. And the reason why that's important to understand is there's no imperialistic element to it whatsoever. Imperialistic meaning being governed by something like a monarchy. This sets America apart from England, most definitely, and how it's being created. Nothing similar to the established England overseas. All right, now we're moving on to these foreign weaknesses. The states had separate interests. So what Connecticut, let's say, was interested in is not necessarily going to be the same as what Georgia is interested in. So that was a definite weakness of this Confederation on the issues of foreign affairs, foreign meaning whatever we did with other countries outside of the United States. The European powers could play on jealousies among the states. So basically, this was problematic with the trade because of the tariffs. So one state could set one tariff for its raw materials, whereas another state could set a different amount of money for their tariffs for that same raw material. So states are competing against one another for their imports and their exports overseas, mostly overseas. So now our states are competing with one another for commercial trade, which is difficult. We should not be having these problems, but it's natural that they would occur. We also have domestic weaknesses, meaning we're having weaknesses among the states with one another, not having to do with anything overseas. So there was a problem of even keeping peace. There was inner fighting between the states. That's emphasized with this Newburgh conspiracy, where in this, they wanted to have George Washington to be the military ruler over the country, and he refused to do so. This also had to do with payments to soldiers because this new country is having a hard time paying the soldiers that were fighting and had fought in the American Revolution. So when people who saw this as a weakness, they said we need a ruler. That's when they asked Washington to be the ruler, but he rejected it. This is very much a challenge, this whole setting up of our Confederation for a new and fragile government of a country, a new country. Then we have Shay's rebellion that happened. Shay is also a veteran of the American Revolution, and he is now gone back to farming. And he's having a tough time, as well as many, many thousands of other farmers, because they're not being able to make it. They're not able to make money. If they're making money, it's state issued money, and sometimes that doesn't have the value that it should have. So they're having a tough time. So this man, Mr. Shay in Massachusetts, decides to get together a group of people, and they go to storm where they can get the weapons of the militia, and they're storming the government buildings. But the militia was able to crush the uprising right away. So they are now realizing we can't have any more anarchy. We need a strong central government. Even though this happened in Massachusetts, it was an issue that was concerning all of the states on the whole nation. Okay, so this ends the section on the Confederation. So at this point, you should be able to answer what was the nature and structure of the Confederation and government. So if you need to go back a few slides to answer that, please do so. You should be able to answer what were the successes and failures of the Confederation. Now we're moving on into the next section, which is called a new charter. Because the Confederation was, I wouldn't want to say a failure, because it did give us some great guidelines for settling the country issues, the issues for this new country. They do realize at this point that a new charter is needed. And that's even the name of this section, the new charter. So at the end of this section, you should be able to answer what measures are taken to ensure that representation in government is fair, what 3 major compromises occurred at the convention, and while the members of the Constitutional Congress are interested in democracy, why do they choose a different form of government? What is that form of government? So the Founding Fathers realized they need to meet again. We need a new plan. So we have the Annapolis Convention, which actually meets at George Washington's home. We have, it wasn't very popular. Only 5 states ended up coming to this convention. So since it was not represented well, the Founding Fathers realized that we need to have another convention that's going to be better attended, and they call for one to happen or take place in Philadelphia. This is called the Constitutional Convention. James Madison is known as the father of our Constitution in America. He did a great deal to help pen and with some ideas of the Constitution at this convention that end up having a sticking power for what we have as today as our Constitution. So now all 12 states show up. Wait, we have 13, not 12. Yes, Rhode Island said that they would not attend this Constitutional Convention. The reason for this was on 3 different scores. One, they saw that the Constitution that they were putting together was giving too much power to central government. That frightened Rhode Island. Number 2 was that states, the Constitution said states could no longer print their own paper money. Actually, Rhode Island had a they were printing too much money. They were having a terrible time with their economy because of printing their own money. Then number 3, the Rhode Island people they saw that the Constitution failed to explicitly protect religious freedom. Remember, that was a core value in Rhode Island. And let's remember Roger Williams. That's the way he broke away from Massachusetts, was for religious freedom purposes. So Rhode Island did not come. George Washington was elected as the convention president. So in addition to settling the basic questions of why they were meeting, the convention would have to compromise on 3 major issues: representation, slavery, and trade. But before we move to these 3 major issues, I want to point out that this is a great question to pause and think about. This would be a great question on a test or an exam where you would have a question: how would you describe the purpose of the Constitutional Convention? And we know that their first priority is the compromises between the states. But let's look at this Constitutional Convention. What are the 5 W's? When, where, who, what, when, where, and why, and the H, the how. Those 6 questions. What would those 6 questions be? Well, the first one is, who attended the Constitutional Convention? We know that all states attended except Rhode Island. Why didn't Rhode Island come? I just gave those 3 reasons a moment ago. What is it that they should do with the Articles of Confederation? That was what was already in place from the previous section of this chapter called the Confederation. What we're talking about is what they had in place on paper was the Articles of the Articles of the Confederation. So what are we going to do with these articles now? Are we going to revise them or are we going to start over? When did the Congress convene? May 25th, 1787. Where did they meet? Philadelphia. When, where, what? Okay. What is it that they're going to do with these Article of Confederations? Revise them or start over? I believe that's a repeat of what I said earlier, but it's certainly worth repeating again. And then why? Why are they meeting? What exactly is it they need to focus on? Well, they need to focus on these Articles of Confederation. And within that, how are we going to compromise on these three major issues as well? And then the last of the 6 questions is how. How should a government be formed? So going forward, how should we go about doing this? Again, this is a great question, and the supporting 6 questions that would help you think through thoroughly answering that question of how would you describe the purpose of the Constitutional Convention? Who, what, when, where, why, and how, the 6 basic questions to look at. All right, so how are we going to settle these 3 major issues of representation, slavery, and trade? We have a great compromise come into play from the Virginians and a Virginia plan who says representation should be based on population. Well, of course, Virginia is going to want to be based on population because it's one of the bigger, more populated states. They wanted a bicameral Congress, which means basically 2 houses. By the way, that is what we ended up with, having 2 houses. So these 2 houses they were calling a lower house and an upper house. Legislature would have greatly expanded powers. Also, eventually, we had checks and balances in place. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So this is the Virginia plan. It's mostly based on population, even though we have these 2 houses. Well, of course, the smaller states, such as New Jersey, said, whoa, wait a minute, no, we can't do this based on population. The smaller states, like us in New Jersey, would be outvoted on every issue. So the New Jersey comes up with a plan where each state only has 1 vote. We're all equal. They are going to disregard population completely. They want to have a unicameral Congress, meaning only 1 house, 1 voting body, 1 governmental body. So now small states were asserting themselves because they did not want to be dominated by these larger states. So now we have the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan. Roger Sherman from Connecticut comes in and offers the Great Compromise. Here we're going to now have a lower house, which is now what we have is called the House of Representatives, and it's based on state population. So we're going to have, Virginia will have more people in the lower house than New Jersey will have because they have more people in the population. So that's how we will have this governing lower house. But the upper house will have an equal representation. Every state will only have 1 representative. So now we're compromising. Both the Virginia will be represented, or its plan looks very much like what the lower house is in this compromise, and then in the New Jersey plan will be represented by this upper house with everybody, every state having 1 vote, 1 representation. Okay, so when we were asking about the 3 issues, remember the first issue is representation. We've already settled that with the Great Compromise. Now we need to come to slavery and then trade. But let's talk about the slavery. How are we going to deal with it? This is the 3/5 compromise. So, what about all the slaves? Are they going to be counted as population, part of the population for representation? At this point, whether to have slaves or not wasn't a huge issue because right now all 13 states have slaves, all 13 of them. So, are we going to count slaves for purposes of representation? So that means we can have more people. If we have lots of slaves in our state, we can have more people in the upper house, the lower house, that's the one based on population, or not, basically. So if we can be represented, can we also be taxed? Slaves then, it's important to notice at this point that in our declaration, the verbiage was specifically stated as person, not property, trying to assert they were staying away from having slaves being considered as property in the verbiage of the declaration because they knew that would cause problems. The Three-Fifths Compromise did not resolve the growing debate about slavery, but it did settle on a way to count slaves for representation and taxation purposes. So, the three-fifths meant 3/5 of the total slave population for the purposes of representation and taxation. So basically, if you're going to have what was the slave population in North Carolina in 1787? North Carolina, 100,572. So let's do the math at this point. Basically, in North Carolina, in the year 1787, the slave population was 100,572 slaves. So according to this three-fifths compromise, how would we count that population for representation purposes in the government, remember in the lower house, and how would we count that for tax purposes? How are we going to be taxed? Basically, the three-fifths would mean that 100,572 slaves would be counted as a population of 60,343 slaves or people or population. So now we have the trade compromise, was the third of the three major issues. So how are we going to handle trading with other countries? The Congress was given the power over both foreign and interstate commerce. So we're not just going to talk about trading with other countries, but we're going to also talk about trading with one another, state to state as well. That's what the interstate means. So the legislature could not impose any export taxes on the states. The states had to do that themselves because remember, we have people who are afraid of the central government having too much power. Especially in the South, we have their concern because they have more raw materials that they are exporting over, usually over to Europe, overseas. Also, the slave trade was a concern in the South as well. How are we going to be taxed on the slaves that are being brought into the country? And so what they decided that not so much the slave trade could not be ended, but wouldn't it be great if it had been, but rather no amendments to this Constitution cannot be addressed until 1808. If it concerns slave trade, we can't even talk about amending it, and the tariffs on slave trade until 1808. No amendments. Okay, so for these constitutional principles, they want to take back and kind of think of the philosophy behind what they're doing in this new charter at this point. And it's worth noting that the men, these founding fathers, these representatives at this Constitutional Congress do fully understand human nature. They understand that man is inherently sinful, and much of their views at this time were biblical principles that were pervasive in the society completely. I would like to read, if you look in your book on page 129, the first paragraph. This is not to say that the Constitution is a Christian document any more than its framers being the men who are instituting this framework for the government, were all Christians. Some were moral men, some were God-fearing men, and some were neither. But what is clear is that the Constitution was written in a society where biblical principles were pervasive, and the document can be best understood in light of those principles. These principles are not spelled out in the document itself, but they contribute to its fabric. So the key principles of the Constitution center on issues of power. Okay, this is moving on from the philosophy, but also more practical. How are we going to have power? How are we going to divide it, balance it, limit the power, allot governmental, the governmental's power is a good word, but you know, what it can and can't do is just a great way to think of it as well, in view of the fact that we are corrupt beings. So James Madison, remember, he's the father of the Constitution. He is known as saying, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls would even be necessary. So what they decided is we cannot, or we are not going to be completely a one body government at all, and we're not going to be a democracy. So a Republican philosophy is a government run by representatives chosen and accountable to the voters. So this is saying that the founding fathers are opposing any form of monarchy or aristocracy meaning the rich people, but also complete democracy. They're opposed to complete democracy because they know that complete democracy can lead to rule by a mob. Think of a few slides back, if the Shay mob had won, how anarchy would ensue. Anarchy meaning whatever people wanted to believe in at the time would be what the rule would be, which is total chaos. So they could not be completely run by democracy. So we're going to become a Republican nation. So what does this mean? It means that our officials are going to be elected. in this manner. The president is going to be elected by electoral college. That means these are people who are elected to represent a population from each state. House members, remember, House is going to be the House of Representatives is what is called that lower house. House members are going to be elected by popular vote. Today we call these congressmen, and they will represent local districts. And then we will have senators who are elected by state legislators to represent state governments. That's the way it was set up originally. Today, senators are not elected by state legislatures. We, the people, actually voted on them. But when it was originally set up as this Republican government, the senators were elected by state legislators to represent state governments. We've got to have a limited government. We cannot have a tyranny as we have experienced with the Parliament in England. So they have a written constitution that clearly defines the limits of governmental power. But it also broadened the scope of individual liberty, meaning that an individual citizen will have more say in the power of the government, what's going to happen in the government by their voting, how they vote. We're also going to separate these powers so that one group cannot be more powerful than the others. If we divide the government powers, then we can't have one strong central government that will take over and be too powerful, again, avoiding that tyranny. So they divide the government into three separate branches. One branch is the Congress. The Congress is going to be those two houses, the upper and lower house. They make the laws. Then we're going to actually have a president who executes and enforces the law. If you remember, they wanted at one point to have George Washington be a military leader. That was going to be too much power for one person. Does this make you think about the king? Yes, it does. But we are going to have one leader, and he will execute and enforce the laws that Congress makes. And then we're going to have that judiciary branch. We're going to institute courts, and they're going to interpret those laws in court when laws are broken, that the Congress has made the laws. The courts will make sure to interpret or uphold the laws. We're also going to have checks and balances. If we didn't have checks and balances, then any one of these branches could become more powerful than the other. How are we going to keep the power equal between the Congress, the president, and the courts? We have checks and balances, which is going to balance the power among the branches. These checks and balances are more specifically laid out in your book. So please turn to page 131 and look with me as I read the checks and balances section, the second paragraph. The principle of checks and balances is designed to thwart an accumulation of power by establishing a balance of power among the three branches. For example, Congress passes a bill to become law, but the president may reject or veto the bill. However, his veto may be overridden by a two-thirds vote in both houses of the Congress. For its part, the Supreme Court may nullify acts of both Congress and the President if a majority of justices interpret a law as unconstitutional. So each one of these three branches has certain power that can in certain circumstances override something another branch does. Therefore, not any one of the branches can become too powerful. So, our last, wrapping this up, we have the idea of federalism, which this division of power between the national and the state levels of government. We've been focusing on our national government to rule the whole nation. But what is it that the central government, the national government can do, and what can the state level of government take care of. They decided that federalism would have a balance between the national and state demands. And there would be a popular sovereignty so that you could hear the voice of the people. It's an idea that the ultimate source of the governmental power lies in its people. And so federalism is giving a provision for representation. The people have to be represented in the government so that they can be heard with their concerns. Sometimes it's indirect, like the electoral college. The electoral college is ultimately the body that does vote for our president and elect the president. We also set up provisions for an amendment to our Constitution because there may be a need for changes. We the People is an enduring declaration not only of the people's power to rule themselves, but also of the people's responsibility for that rule. So at this point, you should be able to answer what measures are taken to ensure that representation in government is fair. What 3 major compromises occurred at the convention? While the members of the Constitutional Congress are interested in democracy, why do they choose a different form of government, and what is that form of government?